This is the most cheat-like villain in the DC universe. With just a glance, it can perfectly replicate others' superpowers. It is clearly an intelligent robot made of special materials, yet it can flawlessly replicate the genetic systems of superheroes. It merges multiple superpowers into one. Several superheroes are no match for it, and are pinned to the ground and overpowered. Yet such a powerful being is just a pawn, controlled by a mastermind, and the catalyst for all this was just a hand that suddenly appeared at the end of Season 4. At the end of Season 4, the Flash, Barry, shattered DeVoe's satellite with a punch that exceeded his limits, but at this moment, a hand suddenly appeared, and the owner of that hand was quite significant. Her name is Nora, and she comes from 2049, decades in the future. Her true identity is that she is Barry's biological daughter. She also possesses Speed Force, so she is known as Kid Flash. Like her father, Nora frequently uses her powers to travel through time. So, in fact, Nora had been appearing in Barry's life long ago. For example, she had once been a waitress at a coffee shop. This time, Nora's intervention exposed her identity. She no longer hid it. She immediately revealed her father-daughter relationship with Barry. Seeing the identical lightning marks, Barry was reluctant to believe it. After all, his daughter looked older than he did. But he had to accept this fact, of course, due to previous experiences of being deceived. Barry didn't fully believe Nora's identity. Instead, he gave a DNA sample of hers to his companion Wally for genetic testing. In the meantime, Barry would keep Nora close at all times to prevent her from causing trouble. Nora arrived at Barry's workplace. Because Barry hadn't been there for a long time, a mountain of tasks had piled up. Nora showed no resistance. In the future world, she did the same work as her father, Barry. She was already accustomed to handling these matters. Just then, the radio broadcasted news of a new crime. Without any hesitation, the father and daughter quickly headed to the crime scene. As usual, Barry saved the victim first, then he subdued the criminal. But this time, the opponent was very different. After being punched by the Flash, it seemed to be charged with energy. All its metrics skyrocketed. Later, it was discovered that the criminal was named Mark. In the original timeline, Barry would have easily subdued him. However, Nora's appearance caused the timeline to change. Now Barry couldn't handle Mark at all. Nora stated that she needed to help fix part of the timeline. Additionally, the Flash learned that there would be a museum dedicated to him in 2049. It would tell the story of Barry's life experiences. That's how Nora could appear so precisely by his side. However, Barry didn't like this feeling at all. He just wanted to send Nora back to her original time as soon as possible, to prevent further complications. But, Nora claimed that due to certain reasons, she couldn't time travel again. This wasn't a difficult matter for Barry. He remembered the previous superluminal particle accelerator. That thing could easily help Nora return. However, it required time to prepare, so he had to endure for a while longer. Barry was busy investigating Mark's whereabouts, so he left Nora at the base to stay with her mother, Iris. For some reason, Nora seemed to harbor a great hostility towards Iris. Clearly, something must have happened in the future world. Not long after, Barry returned to the base. At this point, the accelerator had also completed its adjustments. He immediately set about sending his daughter away. However, at this moment, an unexpected event occurred. Then, Wally, who was responsible for gene testing, suddenly appeared. He stated that Nora couldn't time travel back to her timeline this way, because Wally discovered that Nora's body had undergone some mutations during testing. A component called negative tachyons had appeared in her body. The effect of this substance was to reduce the speed of speedsters. Thus, Nora couldn't return to her timeline through the accelerator again. Upon hearing this, Cisco said he could find a way to modify the equipment to make it compatible with the negative tachyons. Of course, this would take some time, so Nora would have to stay here for a while longer. Coincidentally, due to the DeVoe situation, there were no satellites available at the base. Investigating Mark would require a lot of time, but with Nora's help, it might greatly shorten the time needed. After all, they could only use the most primitive methods to find people now. Additionally, Ralph at the base was set to investigate the Frost Killer with Caitlyn, so the base was currently short-staffed. Cisco, through his abilities, saw that Caitlyn had become the Frost Killer when she was very young, and it was very likely caused by Caitlyn's father. To that end, the two could only continue investigating Caitlyn's deceased father. Meanwhile, Mark had become increasingly powerful after that incident. Barry was very eager to send Nora away, to prevent her from causing more timeline disruptions. However, he unexpectedly learned that Nora actually just wanted to stay by his side. Barry then discovered something astonishing. In a few years, in 2024, he would suddenly disappear in a flash of light. At that time, Nora would only be a few months old, so she had never had a father's companionship. that's why she traveled through time to be with her father. Moreover, she was also responsible for the negative tachyon situation. Before Nora set off, she took a ring from the Flash Museum. That was what produced the negative tachyons. Upon hearing all this, Barry felt a mix of emotions. He could fully understand his daughter's feelings. After all, Barry often traveled back in time to see his parents, so Barry no longer insisted that Nora return to her time. Immediately, of course, she promised to return on her own after dealing with Mark. Just then, Cisco finally tracked down Mark's whereabouts. Based on the clues, Mark had recently appeared at the airport, and he had boarded a certain plane. Now the plane had taken off. Mark was highly likely to cause trouble on board. It could potentially lead to unimaginable losses. The Flash and his daughter immediately set off. At this point, Mark had already begun his actions. He used his powers to sabotage an airplane engine. Now the entire plane was in a state of chaos. It was on a collision course with a nearby building. There was only one way to handle the current crisis. That was to use a special vibration to make the plane pass through the building like the Flash. However, this method had a significant problem. Barry and Wally alone couldn't accomplish it. However, Nora had never been by her father's side, so she had no understanding of this ability. In desperation, Barry had to continuously teach her the key points of vibration on the way, to keep every cell in her body in an active state. After several attempts, Nora finally felt that subtle sensation. With the combined effort of the three, the plane safely passed through the building. It eventually landed in a lake. All the passengers were safe and sound. As for Mark, who caused all this, he was naturally unable to escape the trio's pursuit. He might have had the upper hand against one Barry, but now it was 3 against 1 for justice. Mark's troubles were completely over. According to their agreement, Nora prepared to return to her time. However, at that moment, Barry suddenly stopped her. After this brief time together, he had developed a different feeling about Nora's existence, so he didn't intend to let her return right now, at least until she had mastered enough skills. However, Mark's troubles weren't over yet. He was attacked by a mysterious figure. While being transported to Iron Heights prison, the figure held a dagger shaped like a lightning bolt. Everyone, including Mark, was no match for the mysterious person. But strangely, the mysterious figure only killed Mark. It seemed that his targets were only these superpowered individuals. Meanwhile, Ralph and Caitlyn's investigation made a breakthrough. They accidentally discovered that Caitlyn's father's death certificate was actually forged. This meant there was only one possibility. Caitlyn's father might not have died at all. A series of crises had been quietly brewing in the background. However, before these crises could erupt, new crises continued to emerge. The Davos satellite project caused a large number of satellite fragments, carrying dark matter to scatter. As a result, a large number of superpowered individuals appeared among the crowd. Vanessa was one of them. She now possessed the superpower to alter air density, and immediately used this powerful ability to take revenge on those who had markied her. One of her enemies was crushed into a meatball by her. This incident quickly drew Barry and the others' attention. Looking at the meatball on the ground, Barry wanted to pick it up for a closer look, but it was completely compressed from a person. Even with all his strength, he couldn't lift it at all. They hadn't even uncovered the details of this situation yet. Meanwhile, Vanessa was rapidly killing elsewhere. Clearly, she had no intention of stopping anytime soon. Barry learned that Mark had been killed while being transported. The accompanying guards were only injured to varying degrees. Hearing this news one after another, Barry felt it was becoming troublesome. Nevertheless, he had to handle each situation one by one. The first issue Barry decided to tackle was the rampaging Vanessa. The father and daughter teamed up. According to Barry's expectations, it should have been an easy task. However, due to Nora's recklessness, Vanessa seized the opportunity to counterattack. Barry had to temporarily abandon the capture of Vanessa to protect his daughter. As a result, another innocent person lost their life. They lost track of Vanessa once again. They wanted to find her quickly. The only person they could rely on was Cisco, but unfortunately, he had just been dumped by his girlfriend. He was currently wallowing in sadness. Ralph and Caitlyn had been trying to cheer him up for a long time with no effect. During this downtime, Barry didn't waste any time. He continuously taught his daughter various skills he had developed. Although Nora's top desire was to learn the sonic punch, Barry decided to start with something simpler due to the dangers involved. So he first taught Nora his lightning throwing technique. Even so, Nora made a mistake and nearly blew up the base. At this moment, Iris had new investigative results. She discovered that on the night Mark was killed, although all the surveillance had been destroyed in advance, a segment of the killer's voice was still recorded. From the recording, it seemed that the mysterious killer was wearing a breathing mask. As a result, the voice sounded very rough. Additionally, the breathing frequency was quite strange. However, with just this one clue, it was impossible to determine the killer's true identity. Moreover, Barry and the others still had to deal with Vanessa. Although Cisco was in a bad state now, Barry still thought of a way to locate Vanessa. Based on her superpower, once Vanessa used her abilities, the surrounding area would experience weather changes, so Barry's plan was to monitor the entire city's weather system. They quickly discovered a special cyclone appearing in a certain area. It looked very much like when Vanessa activated her powers. Barry and the others immediately rushed to the scene. Sure enough, it was Vanessa. With previous experience, the Flash, Barry, and his daughter Nora first evacuated the surrounding crowd. Then, they used their super speed to create a vacuum around Vanessa. In this way, even if she could manipulate air density, it would be useless in a vacuum. Without her powers, Vanessa stood no chance against Barry and the others. Predictably, she was put in special handcuffs. However, at this moment, an unexpected event occurred. A dagger shaped like lightning suddenly flew out and pierced Vanessa's body. Nora quickly rushed her to the hospital. Barry and the others stayed behind to prepare to capture the arrogant killer, but unexpectedly, in the next second, everyone present found that they couldn't use their superpowers, and the killer's abilities were extraordinary. Barry was actually pressed to the ground, and rubbed against it by the killer, just when the mysterious killer was about to kill Barry with the lightning dagger. The returning Nora saw this scene and screamed in shock, and the mysterious killer stopped when he heard the word father. For some unknown reason, he suddenly halted his actions. In the end, he turned and left. Such a strange action left everyone puzzled. However, Nora claimed that she seemed to know the identity of the culprit. According to Nora, in the future records, there is an enemy codenamed Cicada. Even the Flash has never been able to bring him to justice. His strongest ability is to prevent all nearby superpowered individuals from using their powers. Moreover, Cicada's lightning dagger can fly to him on its own, so he is extremely dangerous. With everyone's current strength, they couldn't possibly handle Cicada. However, there wasn't without a solution. Nora knew a Wells from her timeline. He could help everyone. However, when he appeared, he declined, but he recommended another candidate. That was a Wells from another timeline, a famous detective. This new Wells didn't refuse Barry and the others' request, but he did demand a high fee for his services. Barry and the others worked hard to gather the money for this Wells. Then, Wells quickly got to work. He analyzed Cicada's reactions from the previous battle, and speculated that the culprit was likely a father. However, some of his following deductions even left Barry confused about how he came to those conclusions. But Wells did provide an address. Barry and Nora arrived at the abandoned warehouse. They planned to capture Cicada. However, due to Nora's reckless actions, she nearly got blown up by a bomb. Fortunately, Barry remained calm and composed, preventing the target from escaping. Soon after, the man was taken into custody by the police. Just when everyone thought the matter was resolved, Barry felt increasingly uneasy. He hadn't found the lightning-shaped dagger during the capture. In fact, the real Cicada was still at large. Even the target this time was one of Barry's companions. Cicada had noticed that Cisco always appeared near an elderly man. To lure out the target, Cicada decided to target the man named Joe. However, no matter how Cicada pressured Joe, Joe remained very tough. Meanwhile, Barry and the others realized they hadn't captured the real Cicada, because the footprints of the captured criminal were completely different from those of the person they fought that day. Seeing such a ridiculous error, Wells could only reveal the truth. In fact, he hadn't calculated the identity of Cicada in this timeline. He had previously captured 37 cicadas, so this time, he arranged for Barry and the others to capture the same target. However, because Nora suddenly entered this timeline, the cicada here had changed. That was why the current situation arose. Wells expressed his willingness to take responsibility for the issue. However, the money couldn't be refunded, as he had already spent it all. At this moment, Cisco suddenly received an alarm indicating that Joe was in trouble. He quickly activated a portal to go to Joe's location. Although Joe didn't yield to Cicada, the torture he was enduring was discovered by others. As a result, a distress signal was sent out. Just as Cisco stepped out of the portal, Cicada pushed him back. Then both of them completely vanished. No one knew where they had been transported to. Even Cisco himself didn't know where he was now. Fortunately, he was still able to contact his teammates. Wells deduced their current location from Cisco's description. It was only a few hundred kilometers away from Barry. He could reach there in a matter of seconds. However, even if Barry arrived, the situation would still be dire. His powers were completely suppressed, and he was no match for Cicada. The only support available at the base was Barry's daughter, Nora. This time, she finally acted wisely. Nora rushed to the scene and found an opportunity to hand a device to Cisco. Immediately after, a violent explosion occurred. Cicada was severely injured, and Cisco appeared to be dead. Cicada didn't expect such ruthlessness and quickly fled the scene, but in reality, Cisco was only pretending to be dead. The device he received was actually a teleporter. Once Cicada left, Cisco stepped out again through the portal. After this incident, Wells was full of determination. He vowed to capture Cicada. Meanwhile, Ralph and Caitlyn made a breakthrough after a long investigation. They found a letter from Caitlyn's father in her mother's warehouse. From its contents, they finally confirmed that Caitlyn's father was indeed still alive. However, the letter didn't reveal where he was hiding. Meanwhile, Wells's guess was only half correct. Cicada did have a child, however, it wasn't in the capacity of a father. The girl named Grace was in immediate danger. The cause of all this was the meta-humans. As Wells made up his mind, he moved into the base. When everyone was present the next day, he began to share the results of his thoughts from the previous night. Wells believed they could investigate Cicada's identity from 3 angles. First was the iconic lightning dagger. Secondly, based on previous deductions, Cicada must be a father. He only killed meta-humans, indicating some sort of vendetta. At that moment, Ralph raised a 4th point. He suggested they could focus on the fact that Cicada always wore a breathing mask, but Wells coldly rejected this idea. In his view, it was merely a means to conceal identity, thus, it was not worth investigating. However, Ralph was not willing to give up. Just then, another unexpected event occurred. Barry's precinct was holding its annual softball game. However, an officer suddenly arrived at the scene with a bomb. Even stranger, Nora seemed to have known about it beforehand. Before the officer could act, she resolved the crisis, yet afterward, both Nora and the officer had no recollection of it. In reality, all of this was part of someone's plan. When Barry punched and destroyed the satellite, a large amount of dark matter-laden debris scattered across the city. One of the reporters, Spencer, not only witnessed the Flash destroy the satellite, but also awakened her own superpowers. Afterward, she set up a website to exclusively leak various news stories. Of course, most of them were self-scripted. Meanwhile, Ralph continued to investigate the breathing masks. He was fortunate to find a fragment of Cicada's mask at the battle site. He analyzed the material and located a local factory. However, he discovered that the workers there all wore these masks. The factory owner stated that tens of thousands of people in the city wore these masks. This made it impossible for Ralph to continue his investigation, even though he was just one step away from the truth. Cicada watched Ralph leave the factory. Spencer plotted a new exclusive story. This led to a massive fire. The Flash and Nora both rushed to put out the fire. Her report only included Nora, so Spencer activated his power on the spot. Barry was instantly controlled and rapidly ran in another direction. When Nora finally extinguished the flames, Spencer released his control over Barry, even though he had run a great distance away. Such unusual events naturally caught Barry and the others' attention. They quickly traced it back to Spencer. However, due to lack of evidence, they could only conduct a secret investigation for now. Nora was sent to make contact with Spencer. However, her acting skills were so poor that Spencer saw through her. Nora was then manipulated by him. Iris noticed that her daughter was acting strangely. She tried to persuade Nora to wake up, but was met with a fierce backlash, and she learned an astonishing piece of news.
You put a power dampening chip inside me to take away my speed, and until 6 months ago, I didn't even know I had powers.
Iris could hardly imagine herself doing this, but the truth was right in front of her. No wonder Nora had harbored hostility towards her before. At this moment, Spencer began planning another exclusive report. Barry and his daughter Nora both fell into his trap. This time, Spencer's report claimed that Barry was killed by his daughter. In an instant, Nora was under Spencer's control. Barry, unable to hurt his daughter, could only keep dodging. Under Spencer's control, Nora's attacks were all lethal. Even so, Nora could not take down the Flash. Then, an odd thing happened in the next second. The Flash's speed suddenly plummeted. He could no longer evade Nora's attacks. At this moment, Iris finally arrived. She used a tranquilizer to knock Nora out. With the interference gone, Barry was finally able to release his pent-up anger. Before long, he captured Spencer, Indiana edition. Barry and the others obtained clues about Cicada. Wells, combining Ralph's findings, discovered that Cicada's breathing sounded like someone with severe lung damage. He suspected that the satellite debris Barry had destroyed might have punctured Cicada's lung. That was how he gained his superpowers, and he harbored a deep hatred for meta-humans. The lightning dagger was a special product containing satellite fragments, similar to Spencer's phone. That was why it could suppress everyone's superpowers. With Wells's analysis, Barry and the others finally had leads to find Cicada. They planned to investigate the location where the satellite debris fell, to pinpoint Cicada's specific identity. However, this was easier said than done. They currently had no satellite available. They could not accurately determine the crash site of the debris. Moreover, everyone had their own tasks to attend to. Thus, a manpower search was clearly unrealistic. Ralph and Caitlyn were still busy investigating Caitlyn's father. Using Cisco's sonic ability, they learned that there might be relevant clues in Caitlyn's father's lab. So the two immediately headed to the university, where Caitlyn's father had worked. There, they discovered new clues in the lab. For some reason, Caitlyn's father seemed to be researching the creation of ice and snow. He had left related formulas on the blackboard. By deciphering the clues, they obtained a name. This was a deity from Greek mythology who governed ice and snow. Clearly, Caitlyn's father had a connection to the frost killer within her. Following this lead, Cisco activated his sonic ability again. He immediately saw a location related to this. It turned out to be a long, abandoned chemical plant. A fire had occurred here in the past. Almost all items had been destroyed. The only clue left was a single box. However, at this moment, Cisco, due to using his powers too frequently, aggravated his injuries from the fight with Cicada. As a result, blood began to flow from Cisco's nose. He then suddenly fainted. The investigation had to be temporarily put on hold. Barry encountered trouble again. A new metahuman suddenly appeared. Clearly, he was also a result of the satellite debris. His ability was very unique. He could distort and compress his body at will. This allowed him to easily slip into a tiny jewelry box to steal others' belongings. Barry quickly arrived at the scene after receiving the report. However, he only found a hair left behind by the metahuman. Barry immediately took it back to the base. He intended to use DNA comparison to identify the culprit. However, the test results shocked him. It seemed that this material was not human DNA at all. Meanwhile, the metahuman began committing crimes again. He could easily compress his body, slipping into target locations through the vent grates. He would then bypass the guards to steal valuable items. When Barry arrived, he finally encountered this strange criminal. However, in the next second, the criminal slipped back into the vent, and then detonated the entire building. Barry rushed to save the civilians inside the building. As a result, he missed the chance to capture the metahuman. However, Barry would never have guessed that the guy hadn't actually left at all. He was hiding in the ruins of the building. Thanks to his unique physiology, he could become as thin as a sheet of paper. This allowed him to easily slip through the cracks. Although Barry didn't capture the metahuman, he did find a fingerprint left behind in the vent. Using forensics, he discovered it matched perfectly with a rich kid named Peter. At a glance, Barry identified him as the metahuman. He immediately went with his wife Iris to Peter's house to make the arrest. However, they found Peter's mother hosting a party. The place was filled with social elites. Barry and Iris found it very inconvenient to move. He could only approach Peter's mother, hoping she would cooperate. However, not only did she refuse to cooperate, but she also mocked Barry and Iris. She declared that even if her son broke the law, they country bumpkins had no right to interfere. Then she ignored them completely. Although they didn't get her help, Barry wasn't going to give up. However, what he didn't know was that Peter had been watching him in secret since Barry entered. After the party ended, Barry returned home. While he was video chatting with Iris about how to deal with Peter, he was shocked to find Peter suddenly appear.
Who do you think's his next victim?
Barry was kidnapped by Peter. What made matters worse was that Nora wasn't at the base at this moment due to certain reasons, and they couldn't reach her. The task of rescuing Barry fell to Iris and the others, but Cisco was still injured and unable to help her open a portal. Iris could only go with Ralph and the others to rescue Barry using their own methods. At this time, Peter had taken Barry to the rooftop of a building. He had restrained Barry's powers with dampening handcuffs. It seemed he intended to push him off the roof to his death. However, at this moment, he began to recount his experience of becoming a metahuman. He explained how he was turned into mush by debris filled with dark matter from the satellite, and then he gained such powers. After he finished speaking, Iris arrived just in time at the scene. Ultimately, the couple successfully captured Peter, and this scene happened to be witnessed by their daughter Nora, who was arriving. Along with her reflections during her time away, she gradually began to understand her mother, Iris. The relationship between them began to soften. Caitlyn's investigation also made a breakthrough. Although they lacked Cisco's abilities to assist, they still relied on Wells's deductive skills. They considered a possible hiding place for Thomas. It was an abandoned safe house. Even Caitlyn's mother was unaware of its location. However, given the current situation, Wells and the others could not pinpoint the exact location of the safe house. Everything would have to wait until the satellites were restored. This trouble would soon be completely resolved. Originally, DeVoe's plan included 5 satellites. However, 4 of them were merely for deception. Now, many of Barry's matters were on hold because of the satellites. Eventually, Cisco cracked the codes for them. These 4 satellites were interconnected. This meant that Barry and the others not only regained a satellite but 4 of them. With these satellites, they could more quickly track Cicada's movements, and they could analyze the debris scatter locations. But just then, Cicada moved again. His lightning dagger could sense metahumans, so Cicada precisely located a metahuman hiding in the crowd. He was ready to eliminate her. Unexpectedly, she turned out to be tough. The metahuman's ability was to turn her body into any metal. Ordinary attacks couldn't inflict any harm at all. However, the lightning dagger in Cicada's hand was no ordinary weapon either. As the dagger's ability activated, the metahuman's powers were instantly confined. This sudden change caught her off guard. Ultimately, she met her end with resentment. Barry and the others used the new satellite system to calculate a total of 46 debris landing sites. Among them, there must be a hiding place for Cicada. Then this matter was handed over to Nora and the others to handle. Barry followed Caitlyn and the others to search for the location of the safe house, because this location was actually in the Arctic. With Barry's help, they quickly arrived in the icy wilderness. Barry led Caitlyn and the others through the walls with ease. To their surprise, they found a man inside. Caitlyn immediately recognized him as her long-lost father, Thomas. She learned that Thomas had developed ALS years ago. A man named Swan had taken the opportunity to disguise himself as Wells. He claimed to want to collaborate with him, to focus on his research. He came to this safe house. Thomas used a poison toxin approach to treat his ALS, but he didn't expect it to have unforeseen consequences. Additionally, communication here was only one way. Ultimately, he became trapped there. He could only survive by entering a cryogenic sleep-in, a storage facility. Caitlyn was heartbroken upon hearing her father's plight. She immediately rescued her father from the safe house. However, Cisco was filled with skepticism about this story. He believed things were far from simple. Thus, Cisco secretly investigated Thomas. However, before he could reach a conclusion, an accident occurred with Thomas. He suddenly collapsed and fainted while walking with his daughter. Upon closer inspection, they found Thomas's body was extensively crystallized with ice. It appeared very similar to the Frost Killer. Later, they learned that this was a side effect of his treatment for ALS. Whenever his emotions ran high, his body would crystallize extensively. Thomas discovered that his daughter had inherited this condition. He immediately set out to treat her, but he didn't expect that it would give rise to the Frost Killer within her. Cisco was seriously skeptical of this explanation. However, Caitlyn believed it and intended to use her serum to help her father neutralize the powers within him. However, the injection equipment was very scarce. Currently, it was known that only the Department of Defense had a set. Reluctantly, Cisco agreed to help due to Caitlyn's request. However, he never let go of his suspicions about Thomas. Thus, he looked for an opportunity to return to the safe house again. Using his sonic abilities, he sought to uncover the truth from that time, but he discovered a shocking answer that left him stunned. He hurried back to the base, intending to stop Caitlyn from creating the serum. Cisco discovered through his sonic ability that Thomas had long since become the dual-personality Frost Killer. The evil persona, the Frost Killer, had been using Caitlyn all along. Once the serum was injected, the Frost Killer persona would completely suppress Thomas. Caitlyn didn't believe Cisco's claims at all. They even had a heated argument over it. In the end, Barry persuaded them to confront Thomas directly to clarify the conflict. But when Thomas heard their intentions, he had no plans to continue pretending, and immediately used his powers to knock the three of them out, then stole the serum Caitlyn had made, and quickly headed to the Department of Defense to inject it. When Barry and the others woke up, they decided to go stop Thomas. However, he was already prepared. He had set numerous traps along the way. The near absolute zero temperatures prevented Barry and Nora from using their super speed at all. Some of the air had frozen as well. Everyone found it increasingly difficult to breathe. Only Caitlyn, as the Frost Killer herself, was unaffected under these conditions. In order to protect her comrades who were about to freeze to death, she fully unleashed the powers of the Frost Killer within her. As Caitlyn destroyed the serum, Thomas's plan was completely foiled. However, taking advantage of Caitlyn's distraction, he flew into the sky and vanished. Although Caitlyn had now become the Frost Killer again, the others were well prepared for this. Cisco handed Caitlyn a neural buffer. This would enable her two personas to communicate seamlessly as if they were one. Meanwhile, Wells and the others finally found the satellite debris that caused Cicada's mutation. This piece came from the core of the satellite and had a very high concentration of dark matter. Moreover, it had a lightning-shaped defect on it. They immediately began an investigation surrounding this fragment. They quickly learned that a girl had been injured by this piece of satellite debris. It was clear that this was connected to Cicada. They rushed to the hospital to find the girl named Grace. At this moment, Cicada was at the hospital taking care of his niece. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise outside, and saw that it was Barry and the others. He immediately became alert, and hid in the shadows, ready to launch a lethal strike. However, what he didn't expect was that the attending physician stopped Ralph. The doctor stated that Grace's parents had long since passed away. Barry was stunned. After a long hesitation, Barry decided to leave. Cicada finally breathed a sigh of relief. He couldn't help but reminisce about his time spent with Grace. Cicada's real name was Orlin, and he was just Grace's uncle. His sister and her husband had died in an attack by metahumans. Thus, he became his niece's only guardian. But Orlin had never even been a father. How could he take care of a little child? Under his various neglects, Grace managed to survive many years without serious incidents. As he watched the child grow, Orlin had planned to find a regular job. He even intended to take his niece to the carnival, but then they encountered DeVoe's satellite plan. At that time, a piece of satellite debris struck near them with precision. A lightning-shaped shard pierced Orlin's right lung. Grace fell into a coma due to the impact. Later, doctors diagnosed that Grace had suffered extensive bleeding in her brain. She might become a vegetable from then on. Orlin couldn't accept this outcome. He hated those meta-humans for killing his sister and brother-in-law, and loathed them even more for turning his niece into a vegetable. He was filled with hatred for those meta-humans, perhaps influenced by Orlin's emotions. That lightning-shaped shard flew to him on its own, thus, it became a part of Orlin's revenge plan. As Thanksgiving approached, the world fell into an unusual silence. Barry and the others could finally relax a bit, but at this moment, he recalled what Nora had said earlier, that he would suddenly disappear in a few years. A dark cloud once again loomed over Barry's heart. Just then, an unexpected event interrupted Barry's thoughts. Satellite cloud imagery showed abnormalities around the city's power station. Barry and Nora rushed to the scene immediately. They found that a terrifying thunderstorm was occurring. Not far away was the core of the power plant. If it were destroyed, the consequences would be unimaginable. Without hesitation, Barry rushed to save the core. At this moment, a bolt of lightning struck Barry from above. The powerful current instantly knocked him unconscious. Nora quickly generated a current, simulating a pacemaker to perform first aid on her father. After several attempts, she finally managed to wake Barry up. Although there were no serious consequences, Barry felt that there was definitely some conspiracy behind this event. Upon waking, he immediately went to Iron Heights prison. He checked on a prisoner named Mark. His superpower was weather manipulation. Creating thunderstorms was his specialty. However, when Barry saw that Mark was still locked up, it proved that the earlier storm had nothing to do with him. As Barry pondered who had created the earlier thunderstorm, a bolt of lightning precisely struck Iron Heights prison. Then, a woman emerged from the damaged area. She immediately attempted to help her father, Mark, escape. Barry quickly took her to the base's prison for containment. Seeing her father taken away by Barry, the woman issued a threat.
Bring my dad to Porter Plaza in 1 hour, or Central City is gonna get wrecked.
After the woman left, Barry found Mark to ask about how to deal with his daughter. Mark stated that he didn't know either. Through their inquiries, they learned that Mark's daughter was named Joss. She was born during his high school years with his girlfriend. After the child was born, Mark abandoned both mother and daughter, and completely vanished. Therefore, he didn't know anything about Joss. Hearing this, everyone felt something was off. Later, Cisco's investigation revealed that Joss was a meteorologist. She loved chasing extreme weather. Her personality was very rebellious. She had a falling out with her mother a few years ago. Recently, she obtained a piece of satellite debris. She fashioned it into a staff. This allowed her to manipulate the weather. This further confirmed that there was no deep father-daughter bond. They immediately decided to use holographic projection to see Joss's true intentions. When the two sides met, Joss saw Mark slowly approaching. She immediately summoned a whirlwind to hurl a car at Mark, killing him. However, this was just a holographic projection. Moments later, Mark reappeared. Joss realized she had been deceived and became furious. She once again threatened to destroy the city with a thunderstorm. In her rage, Barry was severely injured. Now, the only one left to rely on was Nora. Soon, Cisco sent over the equipment they had used against Mark. Nora immediately stepped up in front of Joss. At this moment, Joss was recklessly manipulating lightning. Nora spun around Joss with the equipment, effectively absorbing all the lightning around her. Joss lost her most powerful weapon. As a cloud of smoke from the explosion rose, Nora successfully arrested Joss. Just when everyone thought the matter was finally over, Wells stopped them. He believed that now was the perfect opportunity to capture Cicada, and indeed, it was. Cicada was at the hospital celebrating the holiday with his niece. Thus, his identity was completely exposed. In the days that followed, Wells and the others took turns monitoring Orlin. They nearly uncovered every detail of his life. However, even so, they didn't take action against Cicada, because they still had no solution for the lightning dagger. If their abilities were completely suppressed during the capture, it would not only lead to a repeat of their previous defeat, but also render all their efforts in vain. After much consideration, Nora proposed a plan. They could create a stronger piece of equipment to suppress the dark matter in the lightning dagger. However, according to her design, there were 3 essential conditions. The first was special metal. The second was dark matter. Finally, there needed to be a collision from a particle accelerator. The first 2 conditions were no longer available, unless they could go back in time, although time travel wasn't particularly difficult. However, Wells discovered that this plan was completely different from Nora's previous behavior. It was highly likely that she was being influenced by someone. There must be an unknown conspiracy behind it. Thus, Wells strongly opposed it. However, Barry believed this was the only solution at the moment, and even if they failed, it wouldn't be a huge problem. After all, they were only taking small items that wouldn't affect the timeline. With Barry's decision, the group immediately began preparing for time travel. Cisco carefully calculated the amount of time needed for the travel. He developed a precise plan for the journey. The first destination was the moment of the showdown with Savitar. At that time, his armor would be disintegrating. Barry would take the opportunity to steal a small piece of debris. This clearly wouldn't affect anything significant. The second target was the time Barry lost his powers. As long as they got that syringe, it would be sufficient. Finally, they would head to the moment of the particle accelerator collision. They would combine the first two items and throw them in to achieve the desired result. With this plan in place, Barry and Nora prepared to set off. But just then, Wells unexpectedly discovered that Nora had a notebook filled with strange symbols. Wells became even more convinced that there was something wrong with her. Fortunately, Barry had seen these symbols before and had asked Cisco to study them. On this basis, Wells was able to quickly understand the true meaning of these symbols. However, before this, Barry and the others had already set off for time travel. They returned to the past as planned, which attracted a swarm of time wraiths pursuing them. Fortunately, Cisco's calculations were very precise. Barry quickly rushed forward to steal a piece of debris during the moment of the armor disintegration. Then he grabbed Nora and continued to run, crossing over to the second target location. At this time, in this timeline, Barry had just lost his powers and was in a low point in his life. Nora saw her father show such a vulnerable side for the first time. The Barry who had crossed over showed no hesitation. He headed straight for the location of the syringe. However, just as he was about to leave, he was discovered by this timeline's Wells. He had to exert a lot of effort to brush it off. This brief delay allowed Zoom, who was stealing speed, to track Barry down. Thus, he learned of Nora's existence. He immediately decided to steal the powers of both father and daughter. However, he greatly underestimated Barry. Since that failure, Barry was no longer the same person. In the end, Zoom not only failed to steal Nora's speed, but was also ensnared by the time wraiths. However, this incident caused the syringe to become damaged. To repair it, they could only rely on Swan. Barry deeply despised that guy. After all, it was Swan who had caused his mother's death. But Nora didn't know this. She even suggested seeking help from Swan. In the end, to defeat Cicada, the two went to face Swan. Upon seeing Barry and Nora, Swan immediately realized that his plan had failed. He kicked violently at this timeline's Barry, venting his pent-up rage. Barry quickly intervened and told a lie. He claimed that as long as Swan helped him fix the syringe, they could return home smoothly as planned. However, Swan wasn't someone who could be easily fooled. He kept asking various details, although he ultimately chose to help Barry and the others. He also learned a lot about the future, especially information regarding Cicada. As Swan repaired the syringe, Barry and Nora once again traveled through time to the night of the particle accelerator explosion. During their conversation, Nora learned that Swan had killed her grandmother. She fell silent instantly, pondering something. Soon after, the accelerator exploded. Barry and the others got what they wanted. They immediately arrived in the future timeline and hid the special alloy in the hospital where Grace was staying. When Barry and the others returned, everyone was fully prepared and came to the hospital to capture Cicada together. With the help of that special metal, they easily sealed Cicada's lightning dagger. Then, Cisco sent it into outer space. Without this interference, Barry and the others unleashed their full power. Cicada was pushed back repeatedly, but just then, another accident occurred. Unexpectedly, Cicada was able to control the dagger. That was far in space. In an instant, the situation reversed again. Everyone's powers were instantly suppressed. Barry was again pushed into a desperate situation by Cicada. At this critical moment, someone suddenly stepped forward. It was Caitlyn, or rather, the Frost Killer. This part of her body was now unaffected by the lightning dagger. In the end, Cicada still lost. However, he wasn't captured by the Flash and the others. Moreover, it seemed that no one noticed. On their way back, Nora secretly went to Iron Heights prison in 2049 by herself. She met with Swan, who had been imprisoned for an unknown period. Could he be the mastermind behind everything? That led Nora to return to the past. But before the truth could be revealed, new troubles followed one after another. In another parallel timeline, all members of the Justice League, except for the Flash, had perished, and that villain merely stated indifferently,
"You did this to yourself, and now, all of you will perish."
He then traveled through time to the universe, where Nora and the others were located. He chose a pathologist named Deegan as his representative here. The mysterious figure known as the Monitor gave a book to Deegan, granting him the ability to alter the laws of reality. From this moment on, the rules of Earth were completely rewritten, so that when Green Arrow, Quinn, woke up in bed, he found that there was suddenly another person beside him, and it was none other than the Flash's wife. This situation left Quinn feeling quite bewildered. However, as the city's protector, he would quickly rush to the scene when he heard of a crime. At this moment, he was surprised to find that he had the Flash's speed powers. This sudden change was something Quinn could hardly get used to. He nearly ran right past it. As a first-time Flash, Quinn wasn't very adaptable, so he shouted his own catchphrase,
"You have failed this city!"
With the buff's enhancement. Although it was thrilling, he successfully captured the criminal. But this made Quinn feel very uncomfortable. He hurried to Star City to find his original body, but he saw the Flash, Barry, training with his partner, Diggle. They seemed to be really enjoying their lives. Although Barry was also maintaining the city's safety, Quinn felt that something was off. He wanted to switch back bodies with Barry. However, at that moment, he discovered that in others' eyes, he looked just like Barry. Similarly, Barry appeared as Quinn to everyone else. He suddenly started babbling about body swapping, leading everyone to think he might have some kind of mental illness. As a result, they knocked Barry and Quinn unconscious. When the two woke up again, they found themselves locked in a prison. Clearly, no one believed them. Given the situation, they could only escape from prison to seek help in a parallel universe. Meanwhile, Iris and the others finally noticed something was wrong. The sky had turned red and the lightning was yellow. Cisco used his vibration abilities to search for the source of the change. He unexpectedly saw the bald man. He called himself the Monitor. Barry and the others blocked the prison toilet to cause a short circuit in the cell. This completely suppressed their abilities. Then, Quinn effortlessly used his speed to run through the walls and escape the cell. Quinn took Barry and ran all the way to Earth 38. They met the Super Siblings there. Compared to the disguises of the Flash and Green Arrow, the Super Siblings were much simpler. As long as they wore glasses, no one could recognize them. Kara, the Supergirl, was one of the few who could see through Quinn and Barry's true identities. After understanding the situation, Kara decided to help the two. However, before that, Quinn and Barry needed to familiarize themselves with their new body's abilities. Therefore, the two engaged in some training. The most important part was their catchphrases. After a brief practice, they became the Fierce Flash and the comedic Green Arrow. As the two got ready, the crisis on Earth with Iris entered a new phase. A super villain known as Amazo was awakened. He possessed the nanoserum of Mirakuru, allowing him to replicate anyone's superpowers at will. Moreover, Amazo could exert power far beyond that of the original owners. Thus, Frost Killer Caitlyn and Elongated Man Ralph were no match for Amazo even when teaming up. According to Iris and the others' estimates, without the Flash, even if they all fought together, they were no match for Amazo. Without Iris and the others' restrictions, Amazo was wreaking havoc in the city. He was continuously hunting other metahumans. His goal was to replicate their superpowers. At this moment, Barry and Quinn returned, and they were accompanied by the Super Siblings. The four wasted no time and immediately went to confront Amazo. However, aside from Superman Clark suddenly attacking Amazo at the start, once he replicated Superman's powers, the four of them could do nothing against Amazo, even if they teamed up. Instead, they were pushed back by Amazo. If this continued, the four would surely lose, so Quinn came up with a cunning plan. He would create a special virus arrow. The Super Siblings would draw Amazo's attention, and then he would sneak in to take down Amazo. This was indeed the only option for the four at this moment. Thus, they immediately sprang into action. With everyone's combined efforts, Amazo finally showed a flaw. Quinn seized this rare opportunity and hit Amazo with an arrow.
Amazo, you have failed this city.
They finally eliminated this despairing foe. However, things were far from over. Life seemed to return to normal, but Swan's conspiracy was just beginning. This is a summary of episodes 1 to 9 of The Flash Season 5. The Flash Season 5 revolves around the timeline. It tells the story of Barry's daughter Nora. Traveling from the future to the past, she attempts to change history to stop Cicada's plot. However, the handling of the timeline in the show has sparked a lot of controversy. First, Nora alters the past multiple times in the show, yet the future timeline doesn't show significant changes. This is logically difficult to reconcile. Some viewers question that, if all timeline branches point to the same outcome, then the act of changing behavior itself becomes meaningless. Second, destroying the dagger of Cicada leads to Nora's disappearance. Yet she still existed during the multiple timeline alterations prior to this. This setup lacks reasonable explanations. What's more contradictory is that after Nora disappears, the storage card she left behind still exists. This contradicts the show's premise that time traces must exist within the same timeline. Additionally, Nora's character design is full of contradictions. On one hand, she yearns to become a hero, and to make up for the emotional gap with her parents, her ultimate sacrifice to correct the timeline is touching. On the other hand, her behavioral logic is often criticized as lacking intelligence. For example, her reckless collaboration with villains lacks strategic thinking. Overall, The Flash Season 5 continues the series' family core, but it has been heavily criticized for its chaotic timeline logic and imbalanced character development. If viewers are more tolerant of time travel themes, it can still be regarded as a superhero series with some flaws that don't overshadow its strengths. However, viewers who demand logical rigor may feel disappointed. If you enjoy my channel, please like and subscribe to it.